and I'd long had my doubts about it. And as I got further into Steiner's work, for example, I came across some very interesting phenomena which I'd never come across before in my understanding of Western history, which explained why this yin-yang, if you will, this inner and outer, had taken place.
Mm-hmm.
And if I just might refer to two of those, because
Yes.
they relate to one of my three questions, which was, why do we have no reincarnation in the West? And that is because Steiner made a particular point in drawing attention to two church councils. Ecumenical history, the history or ecclesiastical history, is not something that we study much in school. In England, I don't know about Sweden, but certainly I never studied anything about it until I got to university, and even then I didn't really come across these two councils, and we weren't taught about them. But the one was the Fifth Ecumenical Council of 553, which anathematized or excommunicated or damned the teachings of Origen, one of the early church fathers. And he was somebody who was very much interested and concerned with the pre-existence of souls, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So in 553, a council called by the Emperor Justinian, who was very much concerned to develop a unified church, a bit like, as the Nazis used to say, ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer,
Right.
one people, one empire, one leader. Yeah?
Yes.
Justinian had a certain similar view that he really needed to draw his empire together, in which there would be one emperor, one way of understanding Christianity only, and of course ruled by himself. So he called this council, and there were various disputes going on, and as a result of this, it was demanded at this council that these ideas of pre-existence of souls, which implies obviously one has a previous life, that this would be damned. So from that period, the 6th century, 553, this idea began to disappear, you see. And then Rudolf Steiner draws attention to a second council, the 8th Council of the Church. This is the very interesting one, because this council really was the last possibility, in a sense, perhaps, for Western people to maybe to discover the concept of previous lives for themselves. And this was the 8th Council of Constantinople, 869. The year 869.
Mm.
And in this council anathematized and damned another individual, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, who taught a doctrine of, or was interested in the doctrine of twin souls, the two souls. And this way of putting it, the doctrine of the twin souls, was the very, very last remnant or residue of the idea that the individual has a soul and an individual spirit, and through this individual spirit you could find your own way into the spiritual world, you see.
Mm.
So this doctrine was damned, and it was said that we do not have two souls, we only have one soul with a few spiritual and intellectual faculties.
Mm.
But the main point of this Council, Henrik, was really to make the individual dependent upon the dogmas of the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
The teaching of the church, so that you were not able to find your own way to the spirit.
Hmm.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And so this was the year 869. And I did my own some research into this, and I found some very interesting things, namely that this council was mostly concerned with administrative questions within the church, but that the laws of this council which were passed, there were some 22 of them, and it was law number 11, which is called Canon 11, which was slipped in to this list of laws passed in a rather devious way. And the whole thing went through on the nod, as we say in English, with no discussion.
Right.
The council lasted several months, but it went through on the nod with no discussion. And the whole way that was done was rather sinister. And its background, because it came from Rome, this proposal, and to the Council at Constantinople. It makes an interesting story. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that this was a profound issue of dogma, do you see? Mm-hmm. It had profound consequences. And yet it was slipped in to this council in this rather underhand fashion. So this question, and Steiner draws repeated attention to the importance of this council. When you put that together with the other one, 553, you see there something which many people, and I'm thinking particularly people in the conspiracy world and in the alternative theory world, the alternative history world, right, really have tended to overlook, or maybe they just were not aware of it.
Sure.
That, you see,
and there is. Do you see this then as the kind of? I guess what you're talking about here is like the initial processes of this, the New World Order structure. In one sense, this is to get people dependent on the system and not to go to their own spiritual essence for, well, salvation and healing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's right. And you see, as a result of that, for example, because human beings were in the West were now no longer, this is where the East and the West split, do you see? That before the 5th century, the 6th century, for example, the idea of pre-existence of souls was there in the West. We know the Celts, for example, were into this, and other cultures within Western culture as a whole. But from this time, from the 6th to the 9th centuries, we see this parting of the ways between the East and the West. So the East carried on with its own spiritual processes of individual meditation and what have you, and also concepts of reincarnation and karma. And this door was closed to the West. Now that is a profound historical gesture and turning point, because what it then meant was that those human beings were now, who still wanted to find the spirit, were not allowed to do that in an internal way. And if there were any people who tried to do that, the church tended to then siphon them off into convents and monasteries.
Yes.
And almost sort of lock them up, so to speak. But there were others, Henrik, who didn't go in there, and yet carried on in a different way to try to find their own way to the spirit, and that then led them to seek for the spirit in the world of nature.
I see what you mean.
Means they look for the world in the world of what was conceived of as the world of the Father. They weren't allowed to go to the world of the Holy Spirit. They weren't even allowed to find the Christ in themselves anymore. So they looked for the world of nature in the world out there, the world of measure, number, and weight eventually. And that, combined with what then came from the East via the Crusades and so on, the Arab, the Islamic knowledge, the translation of the Greek texts, and all of this, then fuses together at the end of the Middle Ages to bring us to the early 17th century, and then the takeoff of natural science as we understand it today in the West. But if the church had not closed that door back in the period between the 6th and 9th centuries, that wouldn't have happened.
And so on one level then what you're talking about here is that this has also served a higher purpose as it is, because as you're describing this, I see that there's a reason for this, and actually a positive outcome of that, because of that these things actually occurred and happened, because this gave people the opportunity to go into different paths and to bring out some, well, new information, if you know what I mean, in regards to the relationship with nature and so forth.
Exactly, Henrik. And you and I wouldn't be talking to each other over the internet if this hadn't happened.
That's right.
Because, there would not have been the technological developments in the West, from everything from steam engines to computers, that there have been. So in other words, this technological development had to take place. Yeah. And a certain part of the world, in a sense, had to specialize in that. Now, some people will say, yeah, but what about the Chinese? They developed paper, they developed gunpowder, they developed printing. And Francis Bacon in the 17th century drew attention to precisely those three things. He didn't mention China, but he said, these are the three great technical developments that have happened. But they do all happen to be Chinese in origin.
Right.
So people will say, well, doesn't that prove that The Chinese have been just as great at science and technology as we have. And the answer to that in a certain sense is yes and no. And the no is more interesting because what the Chinese did that in a certain sense by observing nature. But what they did not bring to their observations of nature was logic. They did not bring to their observations of nature what the West has developed from the Greeks onwards, and which was then translated through Syriac and Arabic and brought back to the West and so on. Do you see? So that this is what led the Chinese knowledge to be, as it were, unsystematic and not to lead further than those developments which they made. And indeed, from about the 15th century onwards, when the Chinese, in fact, stopped investigating the world, their great fleets stopped sailing around the world, they retrenched, they turned back inwards again. Because of their own spiritual perspective on things. Yeah.
It's almost like also get this idea that the Dark Ages also kind of enable this in one sense. This term is tossed around, of course, and it wasn't only a very dark period. There were developments happening and progress happening during this period as well, of course. But it feels like we had this a world that was more in connection with each other before that point. But after that, the church, for whatever reason they had done, decided to cut us off from the world, and we became more isolated. We had diseases and a lot of these things that happened. But this have, as you described, has enabled us to go into the direction that we currently are in. The question, though, is that a lot of people say, no, technology is actually it's evil. We shouldn't look there. This has only caused problems in the world, and this is even what the New World Order now is using to help to control people. What would you say to that?
Gosh, you raise a lot of points there. Let me try and take them one by one.
Right.
First, about the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and technology. It is very fashionable today, and has been since the 18th century, since the so-called Enlightenment, to look down on the Middle Ages and look down on the Dark Ages and say this was an ignorant time, as you say, pestilence, disease. Look at the wonderful Arabic civilization, they say, how civilized that was, how scientific that was, and so on and so forth. But it's not all a black-white picture. Yeah?
Sure.
One has to see, if Europe was not developing this outer science in the Middle Ages, what then was Europe actually developing? And one can see that what Europe was developing in this period of the so-called Dark and Middle Ages was the culture of the individual. And that culture of the free individual, even though that is a culture of a free individual which is cut off from the spirit, it was a free individuality which grew in the soul. It was deeply, deeply personal. And it was through meditation. When I say meditation, I mean a devotional meditation. Yeah, not quite in the same way as that meditation is understood in the East, but through the relationship with Christian spiritual paths in the Middle Ages. The Westerners, Europeans, developed an intensely personal, very strongly personal culture, and also at the same time a very strongly social culture. So I'm thinking, when you think of things, for example, like the guilds, the medieval guilds, and the way the workers would help each other in those medieval guilds based on Christian teachings and so on. So I would say that in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, what Europe and the West gained through its relationship, it's a very painful relationship. I'm not saying that wasn't the case. It's a very painful relationship through the domination by the church. But there was always an underground spirit of what, for example, people like Steiner would call an esoteric, almost a hidden Christianity,
yes, which
sustained people.
Yes.
And that grew and developed through the Middle Ages, and that also then emerges, you see, in the modern world, and then we have this very complex interweaving between that and the world of natural science. And I want to come forward now, try and come forward to what you were saying about